She walked into the billionaire's office pretending to be her sick mother, but what he found in her resume left him speechless. The sun hadn't risen yet when Adeline Briscoe slipped quietly out of her thin blanket, careful not to wake her mother. The small, crumbling apartment was silent, except for the occasional wheeze coming from the woman lying on the couch. Delilah Briscoe, once vibrant and strong, had been coughing uncontrollably for 3 days, feverish, pale, and too weak to sit up for more than 10 minutes. She was in no condition to attend the job interview scheduled for 9 a.m. Adeline stood in the tiny kitchen, clutching a chipped mug of hot water between her fingers. They didn't have tea or coffee, not anymore. They didn't have much of anything left except each other. The rent was overdue, the electric bill lay unopened on the counter, and there were only 2 slices of bread left in the pantry. This interview, this one chance, was supposed to save them. It was Delilah's opportunity to become a personal assistant at Lundrix Enterprises, a billion-dollar company known not just for its cold efficiency, but for paying their employees fair and livable wages. But her mother wouldn't make it. Not today. Not in this condition. Adeline took a deep breath and walked over to the couch. Delilah opened her eyes slowly, her voice barely audible. "Baby, what time is it?" "It's early," Adeline said, kneeling down beside her. You need to rest." Delilah tried to rise, coughing violently. "No, I have to go. This is our chance." "You can't even walk, Mama," Adeline whispered, brushing damp hair from her mother's forehead. "Please, listen. I'm going in your place." Delilah's eyes widened. "No, Adie, you can't. I know everything about you. I helped you prepare. I know your work history, your strengths, your goals. I've watched you fight for everything we've ever had. I can do this. Just let me try. Please." Delilah tried to protest, but her voice cracked mid-word. Tears slipped from her eyes as she reached out and held her daughter's hand. "You're just a child. I'm your child." "Which means I'm stronger than you think," Adeline said softly. "And I'm not going to sit here while we lose everything. I can do this for you." With trembling fingers, Delilah pointed to the folder on the small coffee table. The resume, printed the night before and carefully edited over weeks. Adeline nodded, grabbed the folder, and went to the bedroom to change. She pulled her mother's best blouse from the closet, the one she wore to church and weddings, and matched it with a pair of pressed slacks that hung slightly too long on her legs. The sleeves were a little wide, the shoes a half size too big, but with her hair braided into a tight bun and her mother's old glasses on her face, she looked older, just enough to maybe pass. She took one last look in the mirror, then turned off the lights and kissed her mother's forehead. "Wish me luck," she whispered. "I already am," came a faint voice from the couch. Adeline walked 3 blocks to the nearest bus stop in the chilly dawn. Her hands trembled as she clutched the folder to her chest. She replayed every fact, every answer she'd rehearsed with her mom. Her heart thundered as the massive tower of Lundrix Enterprises came into view. Steel, glass, and power wrapped in one monolithic building. She was just a girl from a neighborhood no one cared about, stepping into a world where people spoke in stocks, strategy, and quarterly margins. But she had her mother's spirit. She stepped through the glass doors, shoulders square, and marched to the front desk. "Good morning. I'm here for the 9 a.m. interview for the executive assistant position," she said clearly. The receptionist looked at her with a flicker of confusion. "Your name?" "Delilah Briscoe," Adeline said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. And just like that, she was led into an elevator that hummed softly as it climbed higher and higher into the sky. Felix Montgomery sat at the long obsidian conference table in his penthouse office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the room in morning light. Despite the impressive view of the New York skyline behind him, his eyes were glued to his tablet screen, scanning through endless reports, flagged emails, and digital memos. A half-empty cup of black coffee rested beside him, long gone cold. His assistant, Gail, lingered near the door with a clipboard, waiting for a moment when the billionaire would lift his eyes and acknowledge her presence. He didn't. It had already been a grueling morning. A manufacturing deal with Singapore had fallen apart overnight. One of his senior VPs was threatening to resign, and to top it all off, someone had apparently booked interviews for an assistant position he had decided days ago not to fill. Finally, with a sigh that bordered on frustration, Felix looked up. "Gail, remind me again. Why the hell are we still interviewing for this role?" he asked, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You told me to keep it open until you personally signed off," Gail replied diplomatically. "This is the last candidate. Her file says she has unconventional experience, but some interesting attributes. Her name is Delilah Briscoe." Felix arched a brow. "Unconventional?" That usually means unqualified. She's here now. Should I send her in? He was about to wave her off. He didn't want another bland, copy-paste resume or a rehearsed monologue about working well under pressure and multitasking. But something in Gail's tone, almost a flicker of curiosity, gave him pause. Fine, he said, tapping the screen off and leaning back in his chair. Send her in. Let's get this over with. The office doors opened quietly, and in stepped a young woman dressed in business attire that didn't quite fit her. The blouse was one size too big, the slacks slightly frayed at the ends, but it was her posture that caught Felix's attention. She walked like she had rehearsed every step. Her hair was pulled back tightly, glasses perched on her nose, and in her hands, she clutched a plastic folder like it was a lifeline. Felix glanced quickly at her face. Something was off. She looked young. Too young. Miss Briscoe? He asked, voice cool. Yes, she replied, trying to meet his eyes but flicking her gaze away quickly. Sit, he gestured. She obeyed, placing the folder carefully on the table in front of her. You're here to apply for the executive assistant role. Yes, sir, she said, her voice steady, but her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the folder. He tapped his pen on the table. Your resume mentions various freelance budgeting jobs, night shifts, and helping small businesses manage their cash flow. That's unusual for someone without formal education or corporate background. I believe experience can sometimes matter more than degrees, she replied. Felix watched her with narrowed eyes. There was no arrogance in her tone, just a quiet, firm belief. But something still gnawed at him. How old are you, Miss Briscoe? He asked bluntly. Adeline's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't ready for that question so soon. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose, stalling a second too long. I'm 42, she said, almost too fast. Felix's brow furrowed. He sat back and crossed his arms. No offense, but you look young enough to be a college sophomore. Adeline forced a tight smile. Good genes, I guess. He didn't laugh. Instead, he opened the folder and flipped through the first page. It was neat, borderline meticulous. Her mother's resume was handwritten in tone, but crafted with such careful phrasing it felt deeply personal. Her references were all local, from neighborhood shops and community centers. No Ivy League schools, no former corporate giants, but a string of real people who'd trusted this woman to handle their books, balance their ledgers, and sometimes even mediate disputes. One name caught his eye. Father Marius Langley, Community Outreach Liaison at the Southside Shelter. You worked with Father Langley? For several years, she answered, not hesitating. He trusted me with monthly donations and expense reports. Felix tapped the resume again, this time more thoughtfully. That's not an easy job. One wrong number could hurt a lot of people. I didn't make mistakes, Adeline said firmly, her voice finally carrying a spark of the strength that had gotten her here. He paused, studying her. She was nervous, clearly hiding something, but she wasn't lying. There was an intensity in her that didn't belong to someone simply trying to land a paycheck. There was urgency, desperation, and something else, something deeper. Tell me something, Miss Briscoe, he said at last, his voice quieter. Why do you want this job? For a second she looked down, then met his eyes head on. There was no act left in her by then, no mask, only truth. Because my mother is sick. Because we're behind on rent. Because I'm tired of watching the strongest woman I know break herself every day for nothing. And because she deserves a chance. A real one. Felix stared at her. The office fell into a thick silence. Then he leaned forward slightly, clasping his hands. You're not 42. That much is obvious. Adeline's lips parted slightly, her heart pounded. But you're brave. And honest. Finally. Most people who sit across from me lie about everything, and they have 10 times your experience. He glanced again at the folder. Interview's over, he said, standing. The Gale will walk you out. Adeline stood slowly, unsure whether she had just failed or succeeded in something much bigger than a job. Her knees trembled slightly as she nodded, clutching the folder again. Thank you for your time, Mr. Montgomery. Felix didn't answer. He watched her leave, a mixture of confusion and admiration tightening in his chest. When the doors closed behind her, he reached back toward the folder to read that resume one more time. Something inside told him he hadn't seen the last of Delilah Briscoe. Felix Montgomery sat alone in his office, unmoving, the resume still open on the desk in front of him. He had already read through it twice, but something compelled him to go over it again, line by line. It wasn't flashy. There were no eloquent buzzwords or polished corporate jargon, but it was raw, real, and unlike anything he'd seen in a long time. The resume told a story of survival, ingenuity, and sacrifice. Delilah Briscoe, it claimed, had worked as a night janitor in multiple office buildings, then as a part-time bookkeeper for several small, struggling businesses in her neighborhood. She had no formal education beyond high school, yet had taught herself accounting principles using free online courses and borrowed textbooks from the community center. She had saved a failing corner store by restructuring their budget, helping them avoid bankruptcy by reorganizing their inventory system. She had assisted a retired veteran in managing his medical bills and pension, and she had volunteered at the Southside Shelter, creating tracking systems for food donations and expense reports. This wasn't the resume of a woman trying to inflate her experience. It was the resume of someone who had lived it. But what made Felix freeze was not just the resume. It was the note tucked inside. It hadn't been meant to be found, he could tell. It had slipped out of the folder when he flipped the last page. A small piece of lined notebook paper, folded unevenly. The handwriting was unmistakably childish. He carefully unfolded it. "Dear sir, if you hire my mom, I promise she won't disappoint you. She is the smartest person I know, and she always helps people, even when we don't have anything. I came today because she's sick and couldn't walk. I know it's wrong to pretend, but I did it because I love her and I want her to be okay again. Please don't be mad. My name is Adeline." Felix stared at the paper for what felt like minutes. It all made sense now. The nervousness, the ill-fitting clothes, the slight tremble in her voice. She wasn't 42. She wasn't even an adult. She was just a kid, 16, maybe 17, pretending to be her mother, trying to save her family. He let out a slow, shaky breath and leaned back in his chair. How many people would go this far for someone they loved? Certainly no one in his world. Not the board members, not the polished candidates who walked into his office with their pristine degrees and smug entitlement. None of them would have risked this. None of them would have dared. He pressed the intercom. "Hey, Gail," he said, voice steady. "Get me the security footage from the lobby. I want to know where that girl went after she left. And pull all public records you can find on Delilah and Adeline Briscoe. Start with their address." There was a brief pause before his assistant responded, "Yes, sir, right away." Felix stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched endlessly below, full of people he'd never meet, stories he'd never hear, and yet that girl, someone from a forgotten corner of the city, had just cut through the layers of his detached, polished world with a single, desperate gesture. He didn't know whether to be furious or inspired, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let this end here. He turned back to the desk, picked up the resume, and stared at the top corner where a small coffee stain had marked the edge of the page. That imperfection made it more human, more real, like the girl who had sat in front of him only 20 minutes ago. "Adeline," he muttered, shaking his head, "what are you really made of?" Then, something else occurred to him. If she was this brave at 16, what could she become with the right chance? He didn't waste another second. Felix grabbed his coat, motioned for Gail, and headed for the elevator. "Where are we going?" she asked, hustling to keep up. "To meet a mother," he said without looking back, "who raised a daughter I should have hired the moment she walked in." The knock on the door was firm but not aggressive. It echoed through the narrow hallway of the small apartment, waking Delilah from a restless, fevered doze. She slowly opened her eyes, her body aching as though it had been wrung out like a damp towel. The cough still scratched at her throat like sandpaper, but the sound of the knock jolted her more than any symptom. Adeline, who had returned just an hour earlier with her head lowered and her face pale, was sitting silently by the table, fidgeting with a spoon. At the knock, her eyes darted toward the door. Her first instinct was fear. Had she been followed? Had someone reported her for lying? Her stomach twisted. She stood slowly approaching the door. Another knock, this time gentler. "Coming," she called. Forcing her voice to remain steady, she opened the door cautiously, the rusted chain still latched, allowing only a sliver to see the visitor. Her breath caught in her throat. Standing there in a long wool coat and pressed charcoal gray suit was the man she had seen only earlier that morning, Felix Montgomery. Behind him stood his assistant Gail, who held a tablet and looked just as stunned to be there as Adeline felt to see them. Felix met her gaze through the narrow gap. Miss Briscoe. Adeline, he said calmly. May we come in? Her mind raced. What was he doing here? Was he angry? Would he report her? She hesitated, then slowly unlatched the chain and opened the door wider. Felix stepped inside, taking in the cramped space. The living room was also the bedroom, a faded sofa, a tiny table, two chairs. There were signs of struggle everywhere. Unpaid bills stacked on the counter, a flickering ceiling light, a heater that buzzed weakly in the corner. The air smelled faintly of menthol and stale bread. Delilah, still lying on the couch, pushed herself upright the moment she realized strangers were in the apartment. Adi? She croaked, clutching the blanket to her chest. Who? Felix stepped forward slowly and lowered himself to one knee, his voice quiet but firm. Ma'am, my name is Felix Montgomery. Your daughter came to my office today. She told me her name was yours, and at first I thought it was a stunt, but now I understand. Delilah looked confused and embarrassed all at once, her eyes glassy from illness and shock. I'm sorry, she murmured. I didn't send her. She must have. She did what she believed was right, Felix interrupted gently. And in doing so, she made me realize something I hadn't seen in a long time. He turned to Adeline. You said your mother deserves a real chance. You weren't wrong. Adeline's hands trembled at her sides. She was still trying to process what was happening. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't angry, he wasn't disgusted. He was sincere. Felix rose to his feet and addressed Delilah directly. I've read your resume, ma'am. Every line of it. I've called 2 of your references already. They didn't just praise your work, they were stunned I even found time to read about you. One man said he would have lost his shop without you. A shelter director said you handled more money than some of his paid staff ever could. Delilah blinked, tears forming slowly in the corners of her eyes. I did what I had to, she whispered. Felix nodded. Exactly. And I need someone like you. Someone who understands more than numbers. Someone who's had to fight for every inch of dignity and every meal. That's the kind of intelligence you can't teach at business school. Delilah covered her mouth with her hand, overcome with emotion. Felix continued, his voice steady but warm. I'm offering you a position, not as my assistant, but as a consultant for our community outreach budget. Your experience is more valuable than any degree. And as for Adeline, he turned to the girl, who was now wide-eyed and completely speechless. I'd like to personally sponsor your education. You've already shown me more courage and strategic thinking than most professionals twice your age. I want to invest in that. The apartment fell silent, heavy with disbelief. Delilah was now crying openly, covering her eyes with trembling fingers. Adeline didn't speak. She simply rushed to her mother's side and held her tight. Neither of them could find words big enough for the moment. Felix looked at them and, for the first time in weeks, allowed a soft smile to break through his usually impenetrable expression. This world tends to ignore people like you. It pretends you don't exist. But not anymore. He reached into his coat, pulled out a business card, and set it gently on the table beside a bowl of old, crusted cereal. You don't need to answer now. Rest. Heal. When you're ready, my office will be waiting. He nodded to Gail, who gave them both a kind, reassuring smile, and they turned to leave. As the door closed softly behind them, Delilah clung to her daughter and whispered through her tears, You did this, my brave, reckless little girl. You gave us a second chance. And for the first time in a very, very long time, Adeline smiled. Not because the pain was gone, but because hope, real hope, had finally walked through their door. The following morning was unlike any the Briscoes had experienced in years. The air in the apartment was still stale. The heater still buzzed inconsistently. But something invisible had shifted. Hope now hung in the corners like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Delilah sat at the tiny kitchen table with her tea. Real tea this time. Adeline had run to the local store using the small savings they had kept hidden in an envelope beneath the floorboard. She had returned with lemons, honey, and even a fresh loaf of bread. It was the first time in months that they had eaten a proper breakfast together. Delilah's voice was still raspy, and her body weak, but her eyes had a fire in them again. Her spine was straighter. Her face, though pale, carried dignity. Adeline, though still in disbelief about the previous day, had been wide awake since dawn, sitting at her mother's side like a soldier standing guard. She had replayed Felix Montgomery's visit 100 times in her head. His calm voice, the sincerity in his eyes, and the shocking offer, an actual position for her mother, and a sponsorship for her own education. Now, in the late morning stillness, the silence between mother and daughter was full of meaning. "You really think he meant it?" Delilah asked softly. Adeline nodded. "I do. But why? Why us?" Adeline was quiet for a moment. Then she answered, "Because for once someone saw what I've always seen. You're brilliant, Mama. You've just never had the room to show it." They sat quietly after that, until a soft chime from outside startled them. Adeline ran to the window and saw a black sedan pulling up to the curb. It wasn't a taxi. It was a company car. A driver in a crisp uniform stepped out and approached their building with a document in hand. Minutes later, Delilah was holding a thick, cream-colored envelope with the Lundrix Enterprises logo embossed on the front. Inside was an official job offer, starting salary far above anything they had ever imagined, along with a company laptop, an ID card, and a schedule for orientation. Along with it was a second envelope, addressed to Adeline. With trembling hands, she opened it. It was an enrollment packet for Briarstone Academy, a prestigious private school with elite-level academic programs. A personal letter from Felix was tucked inside. "Adeline, greatness is not born from privilege. It's born from grit, courage, and compassion. You already possess all three. The rest I can help with. Welcome to your future. FM." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back and looked at her mother. Delilah stared at the documents in her hands, barely breathing. "This isn't real," she whispered. "Sid, this can't be." Adeline took her mother's hand and squeezed it. "It is," she said firmly. "It's real, and you earned every piece of it." That afternoon, the company sent a car to pick up Delilah for her onboarding meeting. Felix had arranged for her to work part-time remotely while she recovered and then transition to full-time when she was ready. Adeline insisted on walking her down to the car, holding her elbow gently like the roles had reversed, and the daughter was now the guardian. As Delilah climbed into the vehicle, she paused and looked back at her daughter. "You saved me, Adie," she said, voice cracking. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't need to," Adeline replied, eyes shining. "You're my mom. That's all that matters." As the car pulled away, Adeline stood on the sidewalk, hugging the folder with her school forms tightly to her chest. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was beginning. Something new, something good. Later that evening, while reviewing the forms in their small apartment, Adeline found another small surprise. Felix had arranged for a full scholarship with a monthly stipend, enough to cover uniforms, books, and even transportation. He hadn't just made a gesture. He had made a plan, a deliberate, well-thought-out investment in her future. It left her stunned. That night, she lay in bed beside her mother, just like they used to when storms would rattle their windows. Delilah had fallen asleep with a smile on her lips, the first in years. Adeline whispered into the dark room, not knowing if her mother could hear. "I pretended to be you for one day, but now, I just want to be me." And for the first time, that idea didn't feel scary. It felt like freedom. The following weeks unfolded like a dream that neither Adeline nor Delilah dared to wake from. Each day brought new challenges, but for the first time, those challenges didn't feel like boulders meant to crush them. Instead, they felt like steps, solid, sturdy ones, leading upward. Delilah, still recovering but determined not to let opportunity slip from her grasp, started her position as a community budget consultant for Lundrix Enterprises remotely. Felix had assigned her to work directly with several department leads focused on outreach and nonprofit partnerships. Her job was to evaluate budget flow, pinpoint inefficiencies, and propose practical solutions. Despite lacking a formal degree, Delilah proved quickly that her insights were not only accurate but revolutionary. Within 2 weeks, she discovered a long-ignored misallocation in the company's Urban Micro Grant program. Funds were being looped through unnecessary intermediaries, losing up to 12% of their value before reaching recipients. Her proposal to restructure the funding chain not only restored that lost money, but improved the reach of the program by 20%. Executives who initially scoffed at the idea of working with a non-traditional hire began to respect her. One even admitted privately, "She sees numbers like a surgeon sees arteries." Meanwhile, Adeline began orientation at Briarstone Academy. Walking through the stone archway on her first day, she felt a strange mix of awe and alienation. The building resembled an old Ivy League campus, all towering spires, iron-wrought gates, and marble staircases. Students walked in polished uniforms, their shoes shining, their backpacks lined with brand names she'd only ever seen on billboards. She wore a modest uniform, purchased through the school's financial aid office, clean and crisp, but secondhand. Her shoes were slightly scuffed, and the only accessory she carried was a worn-out notebook that had survived 3 years of hand-me-down schoolwork. Despite the disparity, Adeline held her head high. Her first few days weren't easy. In her math class, she answered a complex algebraic word problem in less than a minute, while others were still reading it. The teacher, Mr. Hastings, blinked at the board, then asked her to walk everyone through her process. She did. Clear, calm, no showboating. Just confidence. The room was silent when she finished. Word spread quickly. Some students rolled their eyes, muttering that she was just a scholarship case. Others began to ask her for help between classes. One girl named Marin, confident, loud, and daughter of a real estate tycoon, approached her after chemistry lab and said bluntly, "You talk like a tutor, not a student. You sure you're not one of the janitor's kids who got lost in the hallway?" Adeline blinked, then smiled calmly. "I talk like someone who's been paying attention." The words weren't loud, but they landed like thunder. From that day on, Marin didn't speak to her again, but others started to. Over time, Adeline built quiet alliances. She helped struggling students during lunch breaks. Her notes were immaculate, her memory sharp, and her attitude never condescending. Even the teachers began to notice. One day, her ethics teacher, Ms. Durham, stopped her after class. "You're different," she said, studying her. "Not just bright, grounded. That's rare around here." Adeline shrugged. "I guess life teaches different lessons when it doesn't hand you everything." Ms. Durham smiled. "You're going to go far." Back at home, evenings were filled with soft conversations, shared meals, and a kind of peace the Briscoes hadn't known in years. They laughed again. Delilah began sketching budget ideas in notebooks for fun. Adeline, often sitting cross-legged on the floor, would help format her presentations in PowerPoint. Sometimes late at night, Delilah would look over at her daughter, deep in study, a pencil tucked behind her ear, and tears would quietly fill her eyes. "I almost lost this spark," she whispered one evening. "If I had stayed sick, if you hadn't gone that day." Adeline reached for her hand. "But you didn't. You raised me to be brave when it counted." And it had counted. The most surprising part came 3 weeks in, when Felix invited both of them to an internal presentation hosted at Lundrick's headquarters. Delilah was expected to brief the department heads on her new budget restructure, and Adeline, dressed in her school uniform, polished and composed, was invited as a guest observer. When Delilah finished her 20-minute presentation, complete with charts and raw figures, the room erupted in quiet but unanimous applause. Felix stood, offering her a firm handshake. "You've not only saved us money," he said with a proud half-smile, "you've redefined how we approach the communities we claim to serve." Then he turned to Adeline. "You inspired this," he said simply. That moment solidified something in both their hearts, that they belonged in places like this, that their worth was not measured by where they started, but by how fiercely they climbed, even when the ladder wasn't meant for them. For the first time in their lives, the Briscoes weren't just surviving systems built against them. They were changing them. Weeks turned into months, and by early spring, the Briscoe household bore little resemblance to what it once had been. The apartment, though still modest, now carried a different energy, one of movement, of upward momentum, of resilience, no longer crushed under weight, but rising from it. New furniture had arrived, not out of extravagance, but necessity. A proper desk had replaced the rickety fold-up table. A second-hand bookshelf now stood proudly near the window, filled with manuals, budgeting journals, and Adeline's growing collection of textbooks. Delilah thrived in her role at Lundrick's. Her name, once anonymous in the quarters of the powerful, had become synonymous with efficiency with a heart. She was no longer just a financial consultant on paper. She was now being referred to, informally but respectfully, as the community architect. Her ideas reshaped the way the company viewed social investment. Felix often called her in for high-level meetings, trusting her instincts, even when they defied conventional models. One Friday afternoon, she stood before a group of senior executives and delivered a presentation proposing a new funding model that would allow small local businesses to apply for zero-interest microloans through Lundrick's philanthropic arm. Her slides were crisp, her voice measured and calm, her math flawless. But what stunned the board was her story. She didn't hide her past. She spoke of nights cleaning offices with trembling hands, feeding her daughter on canned beans and stale crackers, and making spreadsheets on the back of utility bills because they didn't have a working printer. The room was silent when she finished, and then, one by one, they stood to applaud. Felix, who had remained seated at the far end of the table, simply nodded once, eyes glinting. Later that day, he asked her to stay behind after the meeting. "You've changed the way this company thinks," he said quietly, leaning against the window. Delilah smiled, adjusting the single silver bracelet on her wrist, her only piece of jewelry. "No, you just finally gave someone like me the room to be heard." He studied her for a moment before speaking again. "I want you to lead a new division," he said. "Social equity strategy. You'll have a team, a budget. Real power!" Delilah's breath caught. Her fingers trembled. "You trust me with that?" "I'd be a fool not to." Meanwhile, Adeline had begun to feel not just accepted at Briarstone Academy, but valued. Her academic performance placed her at the top of nearly every class. More importantly, students, some even from elite families, began to seek her out, not out of pity, but genuine respect. She had become a quiet leader, someone who didn't fight to be noticed, but whom people listened to when she spoke. During a school debate on ethics and leadership, Adeline delivered a closing argument that left even the faculty speechless. She spoke not from theory, but experience. True leadership isn't just about who gets the spotlight. It's about who lifts others while no one's watching. Her words were quoted in the school paper and reposted online by alumni. The principal herself called Adeline into her office to offer congratulations and mentorship opportunities, including the chance to attend a summer leadership program in Washington, D.C. One evening, while she and Delilah were washing dishes side by side, Adeline cleared her throat and said, "There's something else. I was offered a scholarship to attend the Future Voices in Government Summit in D.C. Delilah turned, her hands still dripping with suds. "D.C.? That's incredible. It's 3 weeks, and they only pick 30 students nationwide." Delilah smiled through misty eyes. "My girl, changing the world already." But what neither of them fully understood yet was how much they had already changed each other and everyone around them. Felix began to visit more often, sometimes dropping by the Briscoe home after hours with folders or just to talk. It wasn't business anymore. It was friendship. It was admiration. He brought books for Adeline, and once even came to see her deliver a presentation at school, a gesture that stunned both her classmates and teachers. He wasn't just a benefactor anymore. He was part of the fabric of their lives. One night, as the three of them sat around the small kitchen table, eating takeout Chinese from paper containers, Felix glanced across at Delilah and said quietly, "You know, most people at my level are surrounded by strategists, analysts, and lawyers, but they all miss the most important thing." "What's that?" she asked. He tapped his temple once, then his heart. "Wisdom that comes from the mind and the soul. That's what you and Adeline have, and it's why you two scare the hell out of anyone who's afraid of truth." Delilah smiled softly, looking over at her daughter. "Then maybe it's time the world stopped being so afraid." That evening, as rain gently tapped on the window and the warm hum of comfort filled the room, the Briscoe women knew one thing for certain. They no longer lived on the outside, looking in. They were inside the narrative now, reshaping it with every breath. The year had come full circle. 12 months since the morning Adeline had stood before the mirror in an oversized blouse, pretending to be her mother. 12 months since she had walked into the glass fortress of Lundrix Enterprises, with nothing but a borrowed name and a trembling voice, praying for a miracle. And now, everything was different. But not because a billionaire saved them. It was because truth, courage, and love had risen through the cracks of a broken system and refused to be ignored. On a bright spring morning, Adeline stood at the podium of the city's grand civic auditorium. Rows of dignitaries, educators, and business leaders filled the velvet seats. Behind her, a large screen bore her name under the gold seal of the National Future Leaders Summit. Her speech had been chosen as the keynote address to close the event. She wore a modest navy dress and a thin silver chain her mother had given her just that morning, one that had once belonged to Delilah's own mother. Her voice rang out clear and steady across the hushed auditorium. "When I was little," she began, "my mother used to write budget plans on the back of old envelopes. I thought she was doing math. I didn't realize she was building a future brick by brick, cent by cent. I didn't understand then that survival itself could be an act of brilliance. A pause. Then she continued. My name is Adeline Briscoe. I'm not from Legacy, I'm from Grit. And I'm here because one day I walked into a job interview pretending to be someone else. But in doing so, I discovered who I truly was and who my mother really is. The room was still. Every eye was on her. She didn't raise me to chase wealth. She raised me to understand worth. Real worth. And I believe that any system, whether government or business, that ignores voices like hers, like mine, will never reach its true potential. Because greatness doesn't just rise from boardrooms. Sometimes it comes from broken kitchens and midnight shifts. And it should be welcomed with the same open doors. As she finished, a wave of applause thundered through the auditorium. She smiled, blinking back tears. In the front row, Delilah stood with her hands pressed together, pride radiating from her like sunlight. Felix, seated beside her in a charcoal suit, clapped with a rare softness in his expression, an unguarded warmth he never wore at board meetings. After the ceremony, dozens approached Adeline, journalists, scholars, even city officials. She accepted their congratulations humbly, always glancing toward her mother, never forgetting why she was there. That evening, the three of them, Adeline, Delilah, and Felix, sat on the rooftop garden of the Lundrix headquarters, overlooking the city lights. A small table was set with a simple dinner, grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and sparkling water with lemon. You made national news, Felix said, gesturing toward his phone, where headlines were already spreading her speech across the internet. I didn't mean to, Adeline replied with a grin. I just told the truth. Felix leaned back in his chair, watching the stars emerge. The world is hungry for that. Delilah reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. You're going to do so much more than I ever could. Adeline shook her head gently. You did everything, Mama. I just picked up where you left off. Felix cleared his throat softly. I've been meaning to say this for a while. He looked between the two of them. Your influence has reshaped how I run my company. But more than that, it reshaped how I see people. You made me realize that potential isn't always wearing a designer suit. Sometimes it shows up in hand-me-down shoes and a borrowed name. There was a long silence as the city buzzed beneath them. Then Delilah smiled. Well, I think we all borrowed names once. But what matters is what we do when we're finally known for who we really are. Adeline looked up at the night sky, full of quiet lights. It felt symbolic somehow. Each star a dream they once thought unreachable, now shimmering within grasp. She thought back to that morning, standing in her mother's clothes, walking into that building not to deceive, but to defend. What had started as desperation had unfolded into destiny. Not because they were lucky, but because they were brave. Because even when the odds stacked like towers, they never bowed their heads. They simply climbed higher, and as the wind swept through the rooftop, rustling the leaves of the garden and carrying the echoes of laughter between them, Adeline knew this was not the end. This was just the beginning. In my view, the ending of this story is not just satisfying, it's deeply meaningful. It doesn't rely on fantasy or dramatic twists, but on something far more powerful: quiet resilience and earned transformation. Adeline and Delilah's journey reflects a truth that often goes unnoticed in real life. Many of the most brilliant minds, the most compassionate leaders, and the strongest hearts exist outside boardrooms, beyond polished resumes, and far from inherited privilege. Their rise didn't come from being rescued. It came from being recognized, from being seen. What makes the conclusion truly powerful is its emotional symmetry. The girl who once had to pretend to be someone else is now celebrated for exactly who she is, and the mother who once scribbled numbers on envelopes is now shaping the future of a corporation. They didn't just escape poverty. They redefined what value looks like. And perhaps most beautifully, their victory wasn't a solitary one. It brought change to others. It softened a billionaire. It inspired a company. It gave voice to many who had none. This ending reminds us that when honesty meets opportunity, miracles don't look like magic. They look like justice.